MyLife, Chassidus Applied, episode 26. Well, there are many things to talk about, and I'd like to begin with the thing that is on most of our minds, and that is Eretz Yisrael. The situation in Israel, and many have been asking the question, what can we do about it? And it's appropriate as well to Chassidus Applied, because we have directives from the Rebbe, and I'd like to share some of those. In a similar situation, unfortunately, in the past, this isn't the first time we've had to deal with issues like this. So, several questions actually came in, and I'd like to read one or two. Number one, of course, is with the crisis in Israel, and we're outside of Israel, and if we physically cannot be there, what is it that we can do to support beyond charity and beyond prayers? What can I do sitting in the U.S. to help our brethren in Israel? I feel it's our brothers and sisters that are under attack. And if I were there, I'd be under attack myself. I can't just sit around. What can I do that is practical and effective? Another question asks, as a Jew who davens daily to return to Israel with the coming of Mashiach and the rebuilding of the temple, I know we need to support Israel, especially while they're under attack. But I'm conflicted. How do I balance my critical inner feelings, not agreeing with all their policies, with showing support? So in Tafshin Lamed Vav, on the 5th of Teves, right before the 10th of Teves, the fast, the Rebbe actually wrote a letter responding to someone who asked a similar question. And I'm sure we could apply it to the situation right now. So obviously I want to begin by our prayers go out to all those families and to all the friends and relatives of those that have been tragically lost. And we should see complete peace in Eretz Yisrael. In a way, there should be no more bloodshed, no more loss of innocent lives, no more threats, and no more fear. And despite the fact that we may be comfortable wherever we may be in the world, we do have to feel as if we are one with them. They are one with us. It's one family, brothers and sisters, exactly correct as this writer writes. Beyond that, so this letter of the 5th of Teves, Tafshin Lamed Vav, the Rebbe writes, in reply to your inquiry and request for instructions in connection with the forthcoming fast of Asar B'Teves, in view of the situation in and around Eretz Yisrael. So the Rebbe is addressing a crisis that took place then, and clearly you can see from the content of the letter it's absolutely applicable now. So I want to begin with this, and I think it's very appropriate to do that. So after a few lines, I'm not going to read the entire letter. The letter is printed in Likutei Sichos, volume 15, page 555 and on, 557, and you can look it up yourself. We also posted it last week on our website where it's fully translated into English, plus a Sikha, a talk that the Rebbe gave, a Shabbos Parsha Vayigash, the Shabbos after that letter. So the Rebbe continued and added, which I'll just read some excerpt, but you can look at meaningfullife.com and you can find the full text there. The Rebbe basically says, however, since you have also approached me in this matter, he says, in addition to being instructed by your rabbi, but since you've approached me, several suggestions after introductory remarks. I think it's important to read these introductory remarks. You'll see in a moment why. Regrettably, there are people who claim that it is necessary to think and act big in terms of global dimensions and stupendous undertakings, etc., etc. Surely they mean well, and to the extent that such resolutions are practical and are actually carried out, they are very helpful to improve the situation. Yet we must never overlook, indeed rather greatly emphasize, the so-called small and unsophisticated things which each modest congregation or even each individual can and must do. Beginning with the old yet ever new Jewish way, collectively as one people and also as individuals. This is the action of HaKoel Koel Yankov. The voice is the voice of Jacob. Torah and prayer, which God himself has shown us to be the first effective action to nullify the power of Yedei Esav, the hands of Esav. In whatever shape or form they are raised against us. Certainly this should find the fullest expression in a day which the Shulchan Aruch declares to be a day of fasting. Now remember, Asar B'Teves is the beginning of the process that tragically led to the 17th of Tammuz and to Tisha B'Av, which we are now in the 3 weeks. So this is very apropos. A fast day, a fast which is called a fast and time favored by God. And then the Rebbe continues on. Why did I read this? Besides, of course, anything from the Rebbe is valuable. But it's interesting, right here you have methodology. We always focus on methodology. This methodology, how the Rebbe both addresses the global and emphasizes the importance of the so-called unsophisticated deeds. And also the emphasis on yet old, yet ever new Jewish way. It's both original and constantly dynamic. And then he goes on to specifics. What does he say? Now, in answer to your inquiry, my suggestion, in addition to the regular observances of fast day, is as follows. During this day, expressly for the sake of the security and strengthening of Eretz Yisrael, as well as in the diaspora, and then the Rebbe adds also for the people behind the Iron Curtain, which was relevant then, more than today, a special effort should be made in the spirit of Yisrael Saba, Old Israel translated, in the areas of Torah, Tefillah, prayer, and Tzedakah charity. Specifically after the prayers both in the morning and at Mincha, afternoon, to learn, and when there are already daily study groups, to add a subject in Torah, including halacha pesuka, a legal ruling. Immediately following the prayers, even before learning, to say several chapters of Psalms, in addition to the regular portion, and before and after the prayers to give charity in addition to the regular, including charity for a sacred cause or institution in Eretz Yisrael, Eretz HaChaim. And then the Rebbe talks about the additional, adding to it is definitely commendable, and as in all things in holiness to add. Then the Rebbe concludes with a blessing and a prayer. As I said, you can read the letter itself. On the Shabbos afterwards, the Rebbe said, in response to the queries of more specific instructions, the Rebbe said, I specifically kept it general because based on Torah has to be studied where your heart desires. Prayer is based on the heart, feelings of each person. And same with charity in the words of the verse, whose heart impels him to give. Thus, he did not want to specify, the Rebbe says, the specifics. Nevertheless, since every inspiration requires details in order for it to be actualized, again you see methodology here. How the Rebbe speaks a Hira, a directive, and relies that we would fill in the blank, so to speak. But since details makes it more real, the Rebbe specifically says the Torah study should be in the Torah teachings of each respective day to study the laws of fasting connected with the 10th of Tevis. In our case, you could also add the Rebbe's emphasis on not just the laws of fasting, the laws of Beis HaBchira, in the Rambam, and in Masechta Midas, Masechta Tamid, and of course anywhere where it discusses the building of the temple, because by studying the building of the laws of the temple, the book of Yecheskel, the Medrash says it's as if you're rebuilding the Beis HaMikdash. This is my own addition from other sikhs, but it's very consistent. And since the ultimate purpose of the fast, the Rebbe says, is simcha, we should study something in the Rambam where he discusses the fulfillment of the promise that the fast days will be transformed to holidays and days of joy and gladness. In prayer, the Rebbe, based on Hira, a directive of the Frierdiker Rebbe, the three Psalms, Chav, Chav Beis, and Samach Tes, 20, 22, and 69. And as far as charity goes, the Rebbe says, since the siege of the wall surrounding Jerusalem began the 10th of Tevis, again this applies to the 17th of Tammuz and Tisha B'Av as well, where not just the siege, but they actually breached the walls and then ultimately destroyed the Beis HaMikdash. Accordingly, based on the words of our sages, I am your wall, this is Torah, charity should be given to a Torah organization, and more specifically, also to help build a wall, charity to construct a Torah building, for the maintenance and repairs of an existing building. Then the Rebbe concludes, there is virtue in the charity outside of Eretz Yisrael and the virtue in the charity given for Eretz Yisrael, therefore appropriate to give additional charity for both for a Torah organization outside of Israel and a Torah organization in Israel, which will be rebuilt by our righteous Mashiach. Eretz Yisrael in general, and Yerushalayim, of course. So there you have a directive. Can't be more apropos for our time. And I believe that answers the question. As far as having different opinions, look, Jews never agreed about things. Especially in this case, when it comes to Eretz Yisrael, there's much to say about, God forbid, mistakes that were made. There's talks of the Rebbe at length about it in the beginning, in 1967, after the Six-Day War and so on. Now, of course, is not the time to sit and dwell on that. We have to be supportive. The Tzahal are people who put their lives on the line to protect other Jews. It's not a time to philosophically be debating every aspect of strategy and so on. You go to a doctor, you rely on the doctor. You go to the military, you have to rely on the military. The general strategy about Israel and so on is not here for discussion. We can talk about it another time. The ideas of feeling strong and behaving strongly and so on. Because at the end of the day, we all wonder, even if this battle is concluded quickly, and it should be done quickly, what happens tomorrow? The next day, we all know it's a powder keg that is constantly in a very turbulent and toxic state. And what do we do on a longer term? I'd rather not discuss it now. This is for another time. But I don't see any contradiction. We support. This is how you help. Eretz Yisrael is a holy land. The people of Israel are our Jewish brothers and sisters. And in general, it's simple menschlichkeit to be part of and participate in every possible way. And here are specifics that the Rebbe shared. Let's move on. As important as this is, there are other topics. Why are you trying to rock the boat? Okay. So here's a question that has come in not just last week, but over the weeks, especially last week because of some of the discussions that I had that may have been a little controversial, for some at least, whether it was the issue of secular education, secular music, and of course the issue of shluchim and emissaries and what form and fashion is acceptable, not acceptable. I just want to say it right at the outset. This platform here, though I am doing the speaking, you can imagine, work hard to make sure that everything is aligned and directed by what the Rebbe said. Something I have a doubt about or is not clear, I'll either state that or I will avoid the issue altogether if I don't have clarity. Just for the record, the secular education topic, though questions came in months ago, I needed more time to really review it because it's a very nuanced and complicated topic, many different aspects to it, until I feel comfortable that I could share where any of you can go trace the sources and see what it says there. And shgiyas mi yavin, if somebody finds an interpretation or a misunderstanding of how I presented it, by all means, please present it. If you find something I've omitted or something I've not seen, by all means. Not only is it acceptable, I actually welcome and I embrace it, because the goal here is izbarer u'v'yislabnu hadvarim, clarity, based on the Rebbe's vision and the Rebbe's words. We all believe that the Rebbe bavarned everything, which means, as the Rebbe said about the Frierdiker Rebbe, a shepherd does not forsake his flock, and as such, the Rebbe bavarned everything till the last day before we will have Mashiach with us and the Rebbe together with us. So if there's any questions, it's somewhere there. Reiku mikemu imreiku. If you don't find an answer, it means we're missing it. This doesn't mean it's always easy to find. That's why exactly I ask and encourage and invite any comments, any feedback, and I try to give as many sources as I can so people can look it up. And adarab, as I said, on the contrary, if you find something that you'd like to emphasize, by all means. Speculation, we all can speculate. And above all, I want to speak about the negei b'dover. I mentioned it many times, I say it again. The Rebbe is a halacha person. Chassidus Chabad is a teira bavegug. The first thing is negei b'dover. We all have subjective biases. Myself, yourself, anyone out there. That's the nature of the beast. That's the way God created us. Maybe beast isn't the right appropriate word. That's the nature of the way of all flesh. We are avisatzmei, avatachas al kol dover. We all have biases. Kol negoy adam reya. Every person sees all blemishes except negoy atzmei. We minimize our own. Based on that subjectivity, we always need to have an objective party or another party to look over something and make sure it's accurate. So I suggest to myself and to all of us here, if anything I say or anything you have an issue with, maybe you should simply look up the sources instead of being so sure about yourself. And I say the same thing to myself, and look inside again. We have one Rebbe, he's the authority, let's study it together. So that is a critical component in general. But now the question is, why rock the boat? Let me pose it in the question that I've been heard. Why are you trying to rock the boat? Why stir things up? Hearing your last episode about secular education, secular music, and the issues you discussed in previous episodes, I'm wondering, what is your objective? Why not leave things as they are? Some people want to listen to secular music, let them do that. Some people want to take secular education. Why do you have to rock the boat? If people want to listen, go to college and conduct themselves in less than a holy manner, why not just leave them be? And same with all your other topics. That's okay, great question. It really focuses on the actual purpose of the entire MyLife Chassidus Applied, which I have to say has, beyond my expectations, I've never imagined that it would be such positive feedback and reactions. I believe the reason for that is simply because I try to stick to not adding and not subtracting from what the Rebbe says, what it says in Chassidus. So let me address this question as well. Well, the question you have to ask is to the Rebbe himself. God forbid I'm not comparing myself, but the Rebbe rocked the boat. The Rebbe went at war with the status quo. Why? Because the status quo is golus. The status quo is an unhealthy situation. As the Rebbe once told someone in Chassidus who said, why do you talk so much about Mashiach? So the Rebbe said it's an illness. When an illness, you don't stop yelling until the illness is gone. You don't make rational calculations. Did I speak enough about it? As long as there's an aberration, you have to battle it. The Rebbe led the way, as the Rebbeim before him, like the battle against apathy, against status quo. That's called rocking the boat. If you want to put it in broader terms, that's the whole Yiddishkeit, and Torah does that. Avram Avinu came. Why do you have to rock the boat? Avram Avinu came, there was a pagan world, people were happy, or they thought they were happy. His father was a big idol manufacturer. He could have been a wealthy, privileged young man. Instead, he decided to challenge it all. Avram HaIvri, he stood on one side, and the whole other world was on the other side. At risk to himself, later at risk to his family, real risk, life-threatening risk, and yet that's what Avram Echad Haya Avram, Moshe Rabbeinu, every leader, because this material world is meant to be rocked, and the only way you do it is by challenging it. So to just accept and say everybody's fine, yes, Ahavas Yisrael and love for everyone is unconditional, no matter what. But at the same time, our goal here is to change the world, not to become part of the world. There's a story with Echad Ha'am. Echad Ha'am was a spiritual Zionist. His name was Ginsburg, Osher Ginsburg, a mishpacha of Tzetzoy, the Alter Rebbe, the Mittler Rebbe, the Rebbe Marash Ginsburg. But he was known to be a very secular but spiritual individual. In the debates about Zionism, he took the theory of spiritual Zionism, not religious Zionism, spiritual Zionism. His student was Martin Buber, just for the record. Once he came to see the Rebbe Rashab, who was his cousin, not sure exactly the details, but he was a cousin, a distant cousin, a close cousin, and they spent time with each other. And this is what the Rebbe Rashab said about him, which is not so relevant here. I'll mention it anyway, L'Shleimus Ha'inyan, that he said he's such an apikatus that even if he saw with his own eyes Kriyas Yamsuf, the parting of the sea, he would deny it. What did he say about the Rebbe Rashab? Unbelievable. An insight coming dafka from a person who was not, even though he had Chassidic blood in him, but not behave that way, at least in a revealed fashion. The Esata, as they say, at that time. What did he say? He said about the Rebbe Rashab, Yodeya es elome u'mechaven limred bay. He knows his world. He knows the world, the material world. And mechaven, and he intentionally rebels against it. Intentionally mutineers against it. The expression is in Chazal and Amalek and others, Yodeya es rebbeine u'mechaven limred bay. When they know the Meirei, they know the master, and they intentionally, in other words, they're not ignorant, they are deliberate, and they know the whole thing, and then they still rebel. Echad Ha'am said the opposite in the Rebbe Rashab. He knows the world. He's not living somewhere in a heaven, in some spiritual plane where he doesn't know what's going on. Well, you could have someone who's such a parush, so separate. He knows the world, and he intentionally, it's a deliberate, bemazed battle against Elam Hazah. So you need, and that is called rocking the boat. What is that? It's basically saying the Rabbeim and the Rebbe, our Rebbe, taught us not to become part of the problem, but to be part of the solution. To be part of the solution, you have to challenge the status quo. In science, they like to say that to change a system, you have to be from outside the system. So for us to become part of the system, then we become part of the problem. What's outside of the system in the language of Chassidus is called Sevav Kalalman. Mamala Kalalman is the energy, the divine energy that maintains existence. And Sevav Kalalman is the divine energy that transforms existence. In the language of the famous Hadran of the Rambam in Tovshin Lamed Hey, the Rebbe Yutas Kislev, Tovshin Lamed Hey, the Rebbe's Siyum on the Rambam, which is printed, Motzei and Eina Motzei. God, like he says in the first halach in the Rambam, he says, without you say this, the foundation of everything is to know there's one source. And without him, nothing can be. The next halach he says, Im yala das, if in mind your mind should arise, that nothing else can exist if he doesn't exist. And then the famous question, how could there be even a halacha that God doesn't exist? And what's the Yala ala das, which is a expression, every word is precise. Yala is like an aliyah in das. And the Rebbe's brilliant answer. The aliyah in das, that God is beyond existence. Then nothing can exist because God is not manifesting himself in the parameters of being a creator. He's beyond being. That's not his primary role. Why is it again halacha to know this? The Rebbe says, because to change the world, you need to reach into the engine room of Eina Motzei. The way God is Motzei, he's reckoning himself with the world. For example, we say, Kosher Kekriyas Yamsuf. By a zivug, by a Chassidus, you say, it's as difficult as the parting of the sea. It's difficult for God? No, based on God, Elikim, Begimatri HaTeva, how he manifests and will not suspend the laws of nature and not perform miracle for no reason. Lo Yushbesu, he keeps existence in its place. There, it's kosher. God himself imposed, not kosher, real difficult. Of course he can suspend. But it's something he himself will not want to do. Whereas Eina Motzei is going into the nature, the power of the forces that create bittul in existence. Ayin Beis, especially the first volume, discusses this at length. The Ovis realigned the world to its source based on the structure of existence. And Matan Torah brings an Er Chodesh. And La'osid Love will be the completion of that, the consummation of that, where the world will be transformed. That's called rocking the boat. That's called that we're not accepting the status quo. This doesn't mean we're looking to criticize someone. We're looking at the standard of the Rebbe. I discussed at length, and I will continue the discussion of shlichus, the secular education, secular music. Can you find heterim? Can you find sources that something is mutter? Yeah, that's called a heter. And we'll talk about that. But is that the standard the Rebbe wanted from us? The standard is he wanted people to go into the army of the Rebbe's army and to go beyond the letter of the law, to transform the world and not become part of it. Even if you become part of it, al pi halacha, that's fine. So you're dealing with a lakus as it's measured in this world. You want to bring Mashiach, you want to transform, you need to do something from outside the system. And that's the key to what Chassidus is and Chassidus Applied. So I would not live up to the truth, to the integrity of the whole purpose of Chassidus if this was not the constant theme in every possible way. What is the standard? Then we have to work out, where do I stand compared to that standard and try to grow and develop, etc., etc. In the language of Tanya, there's Kedusha, there's Klipas Nega, Shlosh Klipas Atmei. Shlosh Klipas Atmei is, as it says in Chassidus, that the Nitzutz Kedusha, the divine, is so concealed, it's like Chaticha Nas Nevela, which means like a piece of meat that became unkosher because it fell into an unkosher vat, and therefore the spark is inaccessible. There's no revelation of the divine. You're not allowed to go there. Tshuva is a whole other story, as he explains in Tanya in chapter 7. Then there's Kedusha, things that are Kedusha. Kedusha means it's receptive, like bittul to alakus. And Klipas Nega is the majority of our lives, the Rishus. The goal is to take the Rishus and be Mekadesh L'Shem Shemayim. Not to just say, you know what, let me eat, not for a taiva, and also not L'Shem Shemayim. That's acceptable, but it's not the standard. That's not the purpose of why we came down to earth, to leave the world as it is. So therefore, in all the discussions, and I will now apply this in a few minutes to the following up the discussion on secular education and on shlichus and so on, the standard is one of changing the reality. And therefore, yes, rocking the boat is exactly what's needed here. This isn't about sensationalism. This is about looking at a situation and looking what the Rebbe wants. Not what I want, not what you want, not what's comfortable. What is expected of us, and then living up to it. We talked a few weeks ago about shlichus. I got many letters. What happens if I can't go on shlichus? Look, this is what the Rebbe set the standard. Join my army, change the world with me. You want to do that or don't want to do that? I'm not getting into whether everyone has free will, clearly. To be melamed zchus on somebody that chose not to be particularly in that fashion and wants to be a business person and give tzedakah and live a life of Yiras Shamayim and derech eretz and follow Torah and mitzvahs and build up a beautiful family? Absolutely. Sure, the brachas as well. But is that the standard of coming to change the world? Is that part of the world? It's more part. Obviously, Torah and mitzvahs always changes the world, but we're talking about in the fullest fashion possible that Chassidus and the Rebbeim and the Rebbe wanted of us. Not to become part of it. This doesn't mean, by the way, that we're out to break the world in a way that's not halacha, God forbid, or in a way that's chutzpah, or that way that's not darkei nimus. Limred boy means to transform in a beautiful way. That you show a higher standard and people embrace it and say, wow, here's some people who didn't buy into the status quo. They didn't just go and say, listen, assimilation is taking over after World War II, look what happened. People are apathetic. They went to war against apathy. So with that said, this can be applied to every given issue. And I want to just read one settle. There's a letter from the Rebbe that the Rebbe writes to an answer. And I'll read it and I'll translate. Someone wrote to the Rebbe that he's she'ena mesadav klal b'inyonim. He doesn't get involved in the inyonim. It looks like, whatever, maybe it was involved with some politics, maybe not, I'm not sure. I can't tell from, but basically he doesn't get involved. Ela emed v'reya. He stands on a side and watches. So the Rebbe writes, Kemuven samti leiv lenukudis kosvei. It's obvious that I paid attention to what you wrote, that you don't get involved in the inyonim, and you only stand and watch. And primarily to what is understood between the lines. Shekilu moving a poshet, as if you're suggesting that it's obvious and without even any question, that this position is absolutely correct. Vitmihani, the Rebbe writes, I wondered, if you also behave that way when it comes to your bodily needs. And the Rebbe continues, God forbid from such an approach, even b'negei to tzarchei haguf, bodily needs, especially the way he writes that he fulfilled this completely to stand on the side and not be involved, completely removed himself from spreading the well springs, also from the bringing Mashiach, like the letter of the Baal Shem Tov. The Rebbe writes in the conclusion, when Mashiach will come, Yamid min atzad emed v'reya. He'll stand on the side and watch. Pretty sharp. I felt appropriate to read this because this essentially captures the whole picture. The Rebbe does not want bystanders, does not want sightseers, does not want tourists. He wants players in the game. I'll share a story with myself. Tov Shalamed, I became bar mitzvah. So I was born and bred in 770. Every Simchas Torah, the children, from my youngest age, I remember we would be under the table by the first hakafah. The table then was a flimsy little bunch of milk cases, cartons, or whatever it was. By the time the first hakafah finished, the cases were gone, so we also couldn't be there any longer. Later, they built a fortress, and etc. So as children, we were under the table. The Rebbe would dance. It was crushed. But it was Simchas Torah, and the Rebbe would bend down the Sefer Torah, we'd kiss it. This is in the early years, the 60s. I became bar mitzvah, put on my fedora, the whole, everything that comes with the entire ritual. And now I'm no longer a kid, so I went to stand with one of my uncles on the pyramids. 770 was small then. It just were being expanded that year. So I stood at one of the pyramids, and I was so proud of myself. After the first hakafah, my father was in the area there where the Rebbe danced, and the Rebbe turned to him and said to him, "Where's your son?" So my father pointed. There I was with my whole beaming, and the Rebbe says, "Doch getanzt mit mir allemal da." He always danced with me here, with the children. Now he also became a spectator. That's what the Rebbe said. So obviously I made my way right down there, and always remained down on the ground. That year, I believe many Bochrim who heard about it also no longer stood on pyramids, they stood on the ground. It's usually reserved for guests. I'm saying this is a Heirah, can move in any way you could see the Rebbe, so it's the story. Ever since, I guess, the Rebbe infused me with that aspect to not be a spectator. Obviously, it's a Heirah l'Rabbim, because the Rebbe's attitude. We're not spectators. We're here not just to participate, we're here to change things, to make things happen. And to make things happen, you have to look at the situation, not to criticize, but to look what is the standard and try to repair it. We have a mandate from the Rebbe about doing everything we can to bring Mashiach. We have a mandate from the Rebbe, you see in this letter, there's no such thing as standing on the side. What kind of standing on the side? Can move and not to be involved in machlekes, which we'll soon discuss, and other things like that. Always in a positive way. So you asked me the question, why do I rock the boat? That's why I feel I have to rock the boat. I just feel compelled to do so. I think all of us should be doing it. And maybe that will ultimately change the status quo and make a shift. When something changes, it usually affects change. Now, with that said, let's move on to the issue of secular studies and following up also the issue of the so-called, I don't want to even say the word because I negated it, the so-called shluchim and what sanctions them, does not sanction them. Everyone understands what I mean. So let's begin with the secular studies. I covered this in the past 2 weeks. And now I want to address the issue of practically applying it. After discussing the general approach, which we discussed the Rebbe's battle against tachlis, meaning the attitude in America and other places that you have to get a secular education in order to be successful. And we also studied the Tanya inside chapter 8. I want to take this now to the next, bring it down to practical advice. What does this mean practically? What is the attitude towards a trade? Is getting a trade similar to going to a college education? What about a job, if you need to get some training to do your job? Questions like this is what I'd like to now address and bring it down practically to each one of us. I'm just looking at my notes here, make sure I have everything. Yeah. So there are many, many questions. I'll try to read some of them. And ultimately, should I go to college or not, is a question that many have asked. So let me go back to the discussion that I began with the Tanya and apply that. Clearly, let's start with halachically. We know halachically, obviously, there are thousands, if not tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of Jews that have jobs. And they're not doing something hepach halacha, because in Hilchos Talmud Torah, the Alter Rebbe and general Hilchos Talmud Torah talks about the guidelines. Like he says in Tanya, that if you're working and you apply yourself to your work, and you study something in order to help you work, in order lavidas Hashem, l'sparnas berevach, in order to make parnasa, even berevach, but it's lavidas Hashem, you know that the purpose, it's only a means to an end, then obviously it's acceptable. Even though there's like a Gemara in Kedushin that talks about, he said, that maniach has kol umnis, I put away all the jobs and I taught my child only Torah. There's the whole discussion. How is that consistent with the fact that you should not get parnasa from Torah? You have to get parnasa from a job. So there he talks about that. But the bottom line is, this is obviously permissible. The question here is not whether it's permissible. The question is what is optimal, which we'll discuss in a moment. Permissible. And there are many conditions of how that's permissible. That Tzemach Tzedek in Derech Mitzvah on Levushi Kahanim talks about this a little differently. He adds, based on the Tanya, that even in Parnasa, a person shouldn't put his head too much into it, more than necessary. Only to know that this is, like he says in Tanya, Kardem Lachtach Bei. This is an axe, this is a tool, an instrument for which to use. They say, Rab Levik says, just like a kardem, when you're cutting down, let's say, a tree, or you're using an instrument to achieve something, you have no interest in the instrument. You only have the interest in the result of it. So there's no koch and there's no involvement, immersion in the instrument itself. It's only a means. So as such, that of course is acceptable. But the Rebbe, as I said before, wanted to change the world. Didn't want just to fit into the structure of the world and do it as halachically as possible. Lefnim Meshuras Hadin. Chassidus is lefnim, going beyond the letter of law. You want to bring Seviv Kalaman into the picture. You want to bring Ein Motzei into the picture. There's a higher expectation. And that's where you quote the Tanya. Why is the Tanya talking to the Chatchila? Just say that. Why is it starting to say Chochmas Chitzenius? You're allowed to learn them if you do it l'shem shamayim, like he says, Kardem Lachtach Bei, or then further those that do it for the purposes of to add in Yediyas, in knowing how to serve Hashem, which can be through, let's say, contemplating on nature and appreciating God's greatness, or l'teirose, learning Hilchos Kiddush HaChedesh. Why doesn't he begin lechatchila? Because the Alter Rebbe is setting a standard. What is your mind supposed to be focusing on? The mind of a Jew should be focusing on what God wants of you, the purpose of your existence. That's Kedusha. Anything else is Metames HaMeach. That's why the Alter Rebbe sets the standard. The Rebbe just continues where that goes on. Is it permissible? Of course it's permissible. Because you need instruments. We live in a world where you need instruments. In the letter that I cited last week from Chelik Tes, from Tovshin Tes, Chelik Gimel Niguz Kedesh, so I cited there that that he brings the different levels, 6 different ways that you can learn. One of the things he says is that in order to fulfill Torah, you need to know some math. You may need other things in order to appreciate, like he went to study 18 months by the shepherd in order to figure out the mumim. So it's a hechsher mitzvah. But you know, that's all it is. The focus is on what? Your moyach is focused on Kedusha. So the Rebbe's standard is that. To the Chatchila go and say initially, I'm going to go and get a secular education, and then I'm going to figure out, that's not for most people. Your job is to fulfill the mission for which you were sent. So there's a sikha, fascinating sikha, many sikhas, which I'm going to refer to in a moment, where he talks in, this is Yud Beis Tammuz, Tov Shin Chav Zayin. The Rebbe explains the Tanya. He says the following. In explaining the Tanya, he says, that what does it mean to be metames hamech? He says Tumah does not change anything physically. You don't see any difference between something that's toid or tomei. With your eye, you can't see a difference. And nevertheless, you say by Torah, you say Torah is metayer the mayach, and chochmas chutzenis is not. The Rebbe asked the question: the same type of mind that you're using by Tana and Ameda and learning the laws of Kiddush HaChedesh, let's say, the laws of sanctifying the new moon, astronomical laws, or the laws of Erevin, which is very mathematical, calculating space and so on and so forth, geometry. What is the difference if someone is studying mathematics? The same ideas, the same way, how you add, how you subtract, how you calculate, how you understand the positions of things, angles, etc., etc. What's the difference? So the Rebbe says the difference is like Torah and Tomei. What is the difference? Because nature, science, its approach is there's nature. The nature of the world exists, and it has its rules, and we cannot change it. And if there is ability to change them, it's also part of the laws of nature. So b'meila, there's no change. Like I said before, the status quo. We're only going to figure out to understand what causes nature to be this way. Which means essentially you're not bringing in any other dimension except what a material existence has. You're understanding the world. The idea why God created the world, or what God wants of the world. The Einemotze, as I said, that's not existent in science. And it's not meant to be. That's why science can only talk about realizing that which exists. When it comes to Torah, and Torah learns Hilchos Kiddush HaChedesh, you're not just learning an astronomical calculation of when the moon is in what phase and what stage it becomes a new moon or so on, or the other mathematical things. The whole point is to understand how to fulfill God's will in this world, to sanctify the moon, or to use that knowledge to some way transform this world. And that's the difference between Torah and Tomei. Think about it. So Tomei simply means because you're just becoming part of the world, and that's what it is. The Rebbe uses actually the same thing, why it says Das Balabatim is Hepech Das Torah. Why? A balabas who learned Torah, why is Hepech Das Torah, which means when it comes to Nyoni Halacha, Das Balabatim, which is a Balabat Shanoch, is Hepech Das Torah. Because a balabas thinks from Das Tachten. He's thinking about the world as it is. And Das Torah is supposed to be Das Elyon, how God wants the world to be. And that's a very different perspective. This doesn't mean the balabas necessarily is thinking Hepech HaTorah, but it means it's Hepech changing the world. That part of it. So the whole idea of secular education, if you really think about it, is about, are we here to change the world, or are we here to just fortify it? Even if it can be used in a good way. And the key here is to understand that. The idea of transforming the universe. Now, this leads to another concept. Why it says in Chassidus that Chochmas HaUmas lead a person to be a yesh, and Chochmas HaTorah lead a person to have bittul. Because that's what it is. If you study the world, And I always wondered, so what, someone studies mathematics, they become a yesh? It's not whether they become arrogant, it's they are solidifying and it's reinforcing existence. That's what it's all about. And therefore, inevitably, it makes existence a more powerful entity. As a matter of fact, now you understand it as well. You can manipulate it. Whereas Torah comes to introduce bittul, that the world is not tefes makom, that it's not that powerful, that this world can be changed and should be changed. The classic story with the chassid, you can say here, the chassid and the philosopher, and they were discussing whether God exists, the debates. And finally the chassid, exasperated, says to the non-chassid, says to the philosopher, he says to him, I envy you, you think about God all the time, I think about myself all the time. He goes away thinking he's flattered. In truth, later he discovers, or someone tells him, that he's actually an insult. You think about God all the time because you know you exist. The only question is whether God exists. So you wonder. Das Tachten. I think about myself all the time because I know God exists. The question is whether I exist. Am I an illusion? Do I exist? Why do I exist? What's the purpose? Etc., etc. This is not just semantics. It's a very different perspective. So this is far deeper than just, can I go and study secular studies or not? It comes down to, are you focusing on the purpose of your existence? And if you are, the instruments that you may need, yes. And that's why the Rebbe stood him so much, especially for children of a young age. A shliach told me the other day that if he studied secular studies at a young age, he doesn't know if he'd be a shliach today. Because his standards and his values would have been shaped by that. He really had almost no choice. So you could say that's a negative thing. Well, in a pure mind, when you're a young person, if you're focused on the right thing, like the Rebbe told Herbert Wiener in 9.5 Mystics, he writes. He tells the Rebbe that he looks in the Bochrim's eyes and he sees that they are naive. The Rebbe says it's not. There's no dichotomy. They don't have two worlds. So it's true in this world to have a duality, to have two worlds becomes very difficult. The whole point of Chassidus, the whole point of the Rebbe is that there should be no duality. So that's the standard on the highest possible level. Very interesting. I want to read something also in Derech Mitzvah Mitzvah's Milah, and it's also in Eira Teire Bamidbar. Let's see inside page 1469 in Bamidbar and Deisofis. He talks about the difference between Aristotle and the Rambam. I'll just read to you a few lines. He says, what is the difference between the philosophers like Rambam and Aristotle? They were both philosophers. The Rambam, the more he understood the truth of God, the more in awe, the more the more diminished he became, the more bittul he had. And that is, the more he understood, the more he became greater in his own eyes, because now I understand in my mind God. But the Isha Leki, the Rambam Adarab Mitzad Hasogazu Yagil Habitla Amiti, Lahafshlich Nafshe Meneged Kol V'Kol, that ready to give his life away for God. And he brings the Ramah in Darkei Meisha Erechaim Siman Aleph, who writes as such. It's a very interesting piece. This is Derech Mitzvah Mitzvah's Milah, and as I said in the Midbar in the Sofas Eira Teire, the concept of bittul. And that's what the Rambam says. That's what the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, like Kagoyin HaRambam and Ramban. The Rambam, in the Madura Kama, I believe it only said the Rambam, because the Rambam, even before he did it for Parnasa, remember he first was his brother before he tragically was killed, he was Mefarnes, he supported the family. It was only after he was killed that Rambam went to study medicine, become a doctor. But before that, his knowledge of secular stuff was because he knew he was only focused on one thing, knowing God better, serving God better, understanding Torah better. Like he says in healthiest Torah, you learn Derech Eretz, Yerushalayim, and so on. So now to bring it down to practical, well, that's the highest standard. That's what the Rebbe wanted of us. That's the highest standard. Now, of course, not everybody necessarily can live up to the highest standard. Like he says in that Gemara in Kedushin I mentioned, that I put all the umnus away to teach my son Torah because Torah lasts forever, whereas a regular job brings you money when you're hungry, and then what happens at the end, it's temporary, as he puts it there. Yet there's also the thing to teach someone umnus. There's a famous hadron the Rebbe made, Chafov Tavshin Yud, where he discusses this. And so Pi Halach also, the Rambam, the Alter Rebbe, Nechus Talmud Torah, speaks about that you're not supposed to use Torah for parnasa. But if, once you've already studied Torah Lishma, and then you can make use of it also for parnasa, he gives there the Hateirim how you can do it. But there were people who Dafka wanted to get a job, a trade, and a trade requires study. So obviously, not only is it acceptable, you find that this was a derech. Is it the standard that Rebbe wanted? He wanted a community to be trade, but it was acceptable because there are ways that you can do it. But don't worship it and suddenly worship the Welt. That's not the point. Maybe a person who's Hashgacha Pratis went into a trade or in any other way, any other way, was involved in material world, could also see Hashgacha Pratis elevated. But as I said before, the goal here is changing the world. This explains why the Rebbe would encourage people who already started college or professors, etc., to finish, because he saw that that's your Hashgacha Pratis, and that's your job to go there and show the power of Yiddishkeit, demonstrate through the tools and the credibility that you have, because it is mutter when you do it that way, like he says in Tanya. But initially, this is the shlichus. Why didn't the Rebbe just choose a whole bunch of mitzuyonim in yeshiva and say, listen, you guys go and become physicists, mathematicians, lawyers, and doctors? Because l'chatchila, the highest way, the best way to change the world is to be above the world and get the minimal you need for that type of, for achieving your mission. Those that are already there, that's their shlichus. And then, of course, people, whatever reason, Hashgacha Pratis, did not go on a shlichus directly, or not in that situation. Obviously, a trade, which is a legitimate Torah trade, as much as you need, that is all focused on helping an instrument and helping you get the parnasa, is absolutely acceptable. And done properly, you actually can make a Kiddush Hashem, and you can fulfill your shlichus that way too. You have the Binyamin Kletzkers, and you have the others that were involved in different type of businesses, who are great Chassidim, and through their business, they use their business for Eined Movade, as the famous story goes when he made his calculations. So bottom line, it encompasses everyone, but still, if you want to talk of the highest standard was established. Now what about, people say today, listen, I want to have a good job, and I want to go to college and get that education. Many people are doing that. The criteria is very simple. Why are you going? If it's completely focused on parnasa, and you don't immerse yourself more than necessary in distractions, and your whole purpose of it is to come change the world in some way, then there's some acceptability there. Now the Rebbe was obviously encouraged people not to go to college for the environment, and above all because usually they don't maintain their focus. But after the fact that someone's done it, as I said, the Chatchila, I would say that if you ask the Rebbe would discourage, I would say, most people. There are exceptions. I'm not here to criticize anyone. I'm here just simply to state, without compromising what the Rebbe said, without compromising integrity. Each person has to go to their mashpia and see their own personal condition. I'm not here to give a blanket statement, but if you look in the sichas, it's very, very clear what the Rebbe's standards are. And I'm going to actually now read a list of a whole bunch of sichas that can help us all look inside yourself. I'll begin with the famous sichas Simchas Torah Tovshin Tezvov, where the Rebbe spoke very much b'yisrakshus, very emotional. And he kept on saying, he talked very strongly about not being metama and focusing. And it's very clear, he was going to war not against education, God forbid, not against knowing math, knowing how to sign your name, against worshiping it, in place of changing the world, becoming part of the world, and succumbing and surrendering. So you could look that sikh up. He speaks also about the age to try to minimize the exposure to age 9. He says age 5 there, age 9, well, they're different ages. But the younger, obviously, because that's when they're impressionable years. Miketz Tovshin Chavov, Achrei Tovshin Lamed Ches. Both those sikhs, interesting. I believe there were talks given with the Pegisha when the college students were here in New York by the Fabrengen. The Rebbe speaks that in general, what I mentioned earlier, secular education does can be metame, and it brings a certain element of reinforcing existence, and also focuses on the multiplicity and duality of existence, the distinctions. But the Rebbe says, interestingly, as the years have rolled on, and we're getting closer to Mashiach, also secular knowledge, science, is coming closer from duality to unity. Yud Shvat Tov Shel Lamed Zayin, that's printed in Likutei Sichos Chelik Tazayin, volume 16, page 145. Ekev Tovshin Memches is a Meredike Siche. And a footnote there, the Rebbe speaks about how everything originates in Torah. And actually there's a very interesting edit that the Rebbe made there when he edited that Siche. It's in Sefer HaSiches Tovshin Memches, where the Rebbe talks about that in Torah, just like science gets to the root of understanding every physical phenomenon, Torah gets to the root of understanding the root of the physical phenomenon and the spiritual phenomenon. And therefore it's all rooted in Torah. And the Rebbe's edit there, it said there that in Torah, Gam Shorshe Haruchni, you also get to know the root of the spiritual. And the Rebbe took out the word Gam and just wrote, you only know the spiritual root. And not only, it doesn't say only, but it takes out Gam. Which means, because sometimes Torah, you don't, for example, in Torah, can you open up a Torah and do heart surgery? Not necessarily. Even if someone can, most people can't. Which leads me to a very interesting concept. It seems, from some of the tzichas and talks from the Rebbe on this matter, that there would be a very, very ambitious and very admirable venture if somebody could actually teach our children mathematics and some of the other sciences that are necessary for life in this material world, through the Torah. Since there's Erevin and there's Kiddush HaChedesh and astronomy, and someone who knows what's out there today in science, modern science, that actually studying it that way, and therefore showing immediately that all this knowledge is an instrument. So the idea of understanding that it's an instrument is critical. However, obviously the younger children, if you try to, they will not necessarily make the distinction, and they may grab and they think the instrument is more important, than the purpose for which it is, which is the reason of the minimizing of that exposure. And then a few other sikhs I just want to throw out there. Bolok, Chukas Bolok, Tovshin Tezvov, Purim and Yud Gimel Tammuz Tovshin Tezayin, Yud Beis Tammuz Tovshin Yud Zayin, Simchas Torah Tovshin Chof, Chof Ov and Ekev Tovshin Chof Aleph, Purim Tovshin Chof Beis, Simchas Beis Shesheva and Purim Tovshin Chof Gimel, Tovshin Chof Tes as well, Shlach Tovshin Chof Tes, Simchas Torah Tovshin Lamed, Yud Aleph Nisan Tovshin Lamed Beis, Purim Tovshin Lamed Hey, Yud Beis Tammuz Tovshin Lamed Zayin, Chayes Sora Tovshin Lamed Tes, and Yud Beis Tammuz Tovshin Mem Zayin. If I said it quickly, you can always go back and listen to it again here. But these are sources that I think you can all look up and find tremendous insights in all these ideas. I would also mention Yutas Kislev and Vayeshev Tovshin Chav Ches, which is very similar to some of the ideas discussed in the Yud Beis Tammuz Chav Zayin that I mentioned earlier as well. Okay, that's as far as Chachmas Chitzenius goes. There's much more to say about this, obviously, and I would love to hear more follow-up questions, and I'll hope to address this in coming weeks as well as we move on. Let me go follow up. Let me follow up on the discussion about shlichus. One person wrote, I was very fascinated by your talk. It made me change a lot of my thinking. I am a shliach that is sanctioned. And I have to say very bluntly that many shluchim have become petty, insecure, businesslike. And they are, therefore, not allowing the proper growth that the Rebbe wants, which is definitely creating more breeding ground for the so-called non-sanctioned individuals that become activists. Again, I'm avoiding that term for the reasons I mentioned last time. Please comment on that. I listened to your last episode closely, another person writes, and as a shliach in the system, I too share the concern of the system becoming overly bureaucratic and corporate-like, which explains why so many are concerned about any who enters the world of shlichus not through the system and therefore free of the red tape. But isn't this an inevitable reality once the number of shluchim grew from 5 to thousands? Now that there are so many shluchim, it seems that there is no other option but to create some form of hierarchy and corporate structure. Is the only way to keep a seder, as you said. Do you think this is what the Rebbe intended? And if so, how can we avoid the pitfalls of being in a corporate environment? In other words, how can we balance order while fulfilling the Rebbe's directive of conquering the world? Additionally, how do we balance the free-spirited and revolutionary nature needed to fulfill the directives at hand? There was fire and excitement from when we went out on shlichus, but maybe with us getting older and losing that spark, we are perhaps compromising our shlichus. How can we bring in the younger generation, which, as you put it, we are currently closing the army to so many new soldiers of this generation? Another question. I thought you addressed the question about mushrooms. Well, that's what he writes in a very nice way. That we need to have a system wherein the maximum amount of Jews and non-Jews are reached with Torah. I also liked how you explained that things have to be done in an orderly way, for instance, through malach and aguch. As I mentioned, the Tzeb is settled about malach, shluchim shaychus to malach. And then he goes on to criticize. The problem is that the people on the top of this umbrella themselves are corrupt and not listening. They're not setting an example. And they're in contempt, or whatever, all the different discussions here. I mean, there are many more questions, many mostly positive. There were definitely some people who questioned, actually most of the negative were before I spoke. Some people were pleasantly surprised as they wrote to me that I was that balanced. They thought for some reason that I'm some anarchist who's going to come out like a wild cannon and lose gun. As I said at the outset, I'm here to not rock the boat except according to the Rebbe's ways. And I think our goal, and I say this to all my colleagues and shluchim and everyone I know, please do the following. We're all interested in what the Rebbe wants, not what I want, not what you want. And we all have a negias. You may already have established a whole theory that works for you, but it could be it's your self-interest that's also in the picture here. That's why it's critical to go back to the Rebbe's words. To ignore the issue, I think, is absolutely unacceptable, is the core heart of the Rebbe's Mesiras Nefesh, to establish lichus, to conquer the world, with Welt Schluchim und Demtein der Welt mit Yiddishkeit, in the Rebbe's words. So I want to read, with the time allotted, a few key sichos that were brought to my attention afterwards, some that I didn't have a chance to address, and let me address that. And here too, I'm going to give very specific sources, so please look them up, and before you comment and so on. Let's start with Va'era Tov Shemem Zayin. Couldn't be better addressed the issue than Va'era Tov Shemem Zayin. What does the Rebbe say in Va'era Tov Shemem Zayin? Let's pull it out. I have it right in front of me here. The Rebbe speaks about building Botei Chabad. The Rebbe came out then with expanding Botei Chabad everywhere possible. Then the Rebbe says, can move on. I'm reading now exactly. You can look it up. It's built in Mugge, but it's nevertheless there. The Rebbe says, Umuven, it's understood that the binyan habayis cannot be an eifon of hasagas gvul. Hasagas gvul, as you all know, is where you breach the boundary and you're taking away something from someone else who was there before you. It should be mokem unuchasi. First of all, the Rebbe says, for the Eibush to be mashta shchinase, for him to rest the shchina anywhere, it has to be al pi halacha. It cannot come in a form of aveda. And since somebody feels they're being hurt, and they're making marish elimus, and they're making such a fuss, it's mevalbel the menuchas hashchina. And the Rebbe says, pshit, it's obvious that all types of terutzim and excuses, that there's a fifth Shulchan Aruch, and you have to use common sense. If it's hepech halacha, it's hepech halacha. So the Rebbe makes it very clear that he wants everything to follow halacha Shulchan Aruch. He says, I never thought, he said like this, from the pshittus, this obvious element here, I never thought that I would have to bavor in such a thing. That to have to clarify that everything has to be al pi harof for Shulchan Aruch, Teres Meisha. But since I see b'poel that there's elements of hasagas gvul, and more than once, I'm right now being ma'eded, that and emphasizing that this, at the first possible opportunity, I'm announcing on something that's obvious, that every pu'ula of establishing Botei Chabad have to be Shulchan Aruch without any chash, any concern of hasagas gvul. That's one thing. But then comes the second half. And I know many people focus on this first half. And here too I want to say, it's critical to read the Rebbe completely. Not to just choose and pick what you like. The same sikha, a few lines later, the Rebbe says, we have to qualify this as the other extreme. The Rebbe's words. The mistake of tipshim, of fools, that are afraid of establishing Botei Chabad that's close to them, because they're taking away from their schus to put on tefillin on a Jew, or taking away from their kavod, chulu, and al derech zeh, the Rebbe says, and all the other reasons that are given. And so much is their tipshus, the Rebbe says, not only they don't let someone else open up another Beit Chabad, another Chabad house, which is, God forbid, impossible to even mention, the Rebbe is saying sarcastically, but they also chase them away. They panic them, feeling that l'daitei, he thinks, in his opinion, he's the balabos in the city. He owns the city and everything around his environment, his territory, and does all kinds of things redifus and causes pain and agonizes the other person. The Rebbe says, if this has happened, let these people do tshuva. Let them go and ask forgiveness of anybody they've heard, or their families. And we have to pray on them, they should do tshuva. That's essentially the gist of it. You can look this up yourself. You may ask, how is it consistent, these two statements? The answer is, I believe, and here I'll elaborate more because time is limited here in the coming episode, is a bunch of other sikhs which I'll refer to right now, and that is Sikha Vayeshev Tafshin Mem Aleph. I mentioned that as well. It's very similar to the one from Va'era. And then there's a shliach is a shliach. The Rebbe wanted Seder, obviously, and did not want Hasagas Gvul. And that's why you'll find sikhs, Vayakil Tafshin Mem Aleph, Bereshis Tafshin Mem Hey, the second Fabrengen, and Vayishlach Tafshin Mem Zayin, where he talks about shliach is a shliach. His Atzah, the Rebbe, and those sikhs says that every shliach out there should appoint another shliach. Ad mea shluchim is the language. And he says clearly, tafasta marubah tafasta, you can't get to 100. So start lesser than that. Now remember, shliach is a shliach. The second shliach is not a shliach of the first shliach. He's a shliach of the Meshaleach, the Rebbe. But the Rebbe appointed and insisted that shluchim do this, because they have that power. They have the power of the Meshaleach. So the answer is very simple. If every shliach out there doubled, tripled, quadrupled, and brought shluchim, you wouldn't need others to come and impose themselves there. I'm not justifying someone imposing, but if you think you're going to just behave and follow the first half and say no hasagas gvul, and not the second half and being a tippish, what do you think is the inevitability? Human nature. There are, as I said, people who want to join the army. So I have no doubt that the Rebbe wanted was that shluchim everywhere, the sanctioned ones, should so double and triple themselves and proliferate that you have, instead of 4,000, 8,000, so there'll be 50,000 shluchim. Find ways. Sit down with smart people, sit down with lawyers, sit down with rabbonim, sit down with Chassidus Applied. You find a way. Listen, read these sikhs, and I'd like challenge anyone to come back and say it's a different meaning than what I've just posed. So the Rebbe did not want anything Eipach Halacha, but just to stop there is like reading half a sikha. It's like reading a half a pasuk. There's another side. Remember, the kavanah is changing the world. And that's what we must never forget. So, because time is limited, can't cover everything. There were some other questions I was going to address. So, I tried to address most of them. I think one I'll have to push off for next week. Just want to say on a concluding note, the same thing with shlichus is also what I said earlier about Seviv Kalam and Mamala Kalam. For shluchim, and for the people who have been zeiche, merited to be the Rebbe's emissaries, the Rebbe wants you to change the world. For God forbid to start becoming bureaucrats and corporations, besides the legal necessity, like I said, like with instruments in secular education, the minimal you need. But to become that type of mentality, territorial, corporate, bureaucratic, is mamish like the opposite of the whole purpose of shlichus. The whole purpose is to change the world, not to become like it. Obviously, as I said, we have to do the legal things and you have to create the structures, and there's the systems in the world, accounting and other things. And it has to be the Seder, Hasagas Gvul, and other things, the Halach and Shulchan Aruch. But the thinking has to be you're a revolutionary. You're here to change the world, not to become like it. So in Chabad, as it grows and becomes establishment, will become mainstream, You don't want to succumb to what every other establishment has become, which is becoming corrupt, becoming petty, becoming narrow-minded. That's why it's critical that all of us connect to the Rebbe, connect to his words, reconnect and refresh ourselves. It's just like the moment, the moment you went out on shlichus, with that enthusiasm, with that energy, with that vitality. That's the key. And the way you do it is Pashat, open up the Rebbe's words. I am simply just trying to be a messenger of carrying what I read. I don't believe that I've said anything here in any type of way that's a negiah. I don't believe I'm a negiah b'dov when it comes to this particular issue. But regardless, we have the words, and the Rebbe bavarned everything. And our job is to do whatever we can to transform this world. The status quo has to be changed. So with this, I'd like to bid everyone a good evening. This has been MyLife, Chassidus Applied, episode 26. You can write in your questions at meaningfullife.com/MyLifeLive. It's completely anonymous. If you want to write to me personally, write please to my email address, Simon, SIMON, @meaningfullife.com. So until next week, Sunday, 8 to 9, everyone should have a very chassidische, shlichusdik, focused on the mission type of week. Thank you.